Hello everybody and welcome back to the History of Humankind. In the last episode we did a review of Sumerian civilization. In this episode I want to introduce you to the Akkadian Empire, which lasted from around 2334 to 2154 BCE. So a significantly shorter period, about a century and a half, shorter period than Sumerian rise and fall, but significant because it was probably the world's first empire. This claim might go to earlier Sumerian kings like Lugal-Zaggisi, but the Akkadian Empire far surpassed earlier attempts. So the Akkadian Empire would go on to influence the Babylonians and Assyrians and kind of set the classical standards for later civilizations in Mesopotamia. It was centered around Akkad, and scholars don't necessarily know where this is exactly. It's probably underneath present-day Baghdad in Iraq. There's not a lot of architecture for us to look at in these videos, but we'll definitely look at some of their other areas of innovation. Most importantly, the Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking people. Semitic language is the first recorded Semitic language, and it would be adopted by Babylonians and Assyrians with using different dialects. As I said before, Semites came from the Levant much earlier, centuries earlier, to places like Eridu. They were tent-dwelling nomads, herders, that had pretty much established themselves by, the 2500s and by the rise of Sargon the Great. Sargon the Great. And they looked different from the Sumerians. They were different people, but they did adopt cuneiform. So Akkadian was a Semitic language written down in the Sumerian cuneiform. And Sargon the Great really gained power in this area here, strategic point at that time around Kish, because whoever controlled Kish controlled the flow of water downstream to Sumer. It's the area where the Tigris and Euphrates kind of almost meet and then separate again. When Sargon the Great was rising up from humble origins, the area had already become devastated by salinization, which is, too much salt. There was poorly drained irrigation, and it reduced the wheat yields. And reduced wheat yields meant the rise of militarism, as we saw in the stele of the vultures, right? So the Akkadians were quite militaristic, but militarism had already kind of started developing in that area before Sargon because of the salinization of the fields. Here we have a bust of Sargon the Great, but also possibly his grandson Naram-Sin, a great king in his own right. And Sargon the Great, you can recognize his Semitic origins by his long beard and more prominent nose. And he also probably wore a long coat. He was the son of a gardener's son, and he became cupbearer to the Sumerian king Ur-Zababa of Kish, So definitely humble origins, and it's still not clear exactly how he rose to power, but he cemented his control by marrying his daughters off to kings of peripheral areas and different city-states, and by setting up his sons and daughters as high priests and priestesses of the temples. His daughter Enheduanna, she was high priestess or Nin at Sin at Ur, and she is the first known poet She's the first poet we know by name. During Sargon's reign, and especially during his grandson's reign, the Lugals, or kings, became more powerful than ever. They took on a divine status. The Sumerians never considered their kings as divine, just as kind of intermediaries or maybe semi-divine. But during the Akkadian Empire, kings could be, whole gods. Okay. Sargon expanded his borders very far, from, the Persian Gulf all the way up to the Mediterranean, and this opened up a lot of trade to places like the Taurus Mountains, and also, I believe it is called Magan, trade to Taurus Mountains, Magan, Lebanon. Like I said before, the Sumerians didn't have all this much access to copper or cedar or gold. They had to go long distances. This sometimes led to conflict. But once all of these places were under one ruler, one empire, trade became much more accessible. And these materials became much more accessible. Their artwork was largely adopted from the Sumerians. Here's a cylinder seal imprint of probably Gilgamesh fighting a bull. So their art was not very innovative, but it was definitely more realistic and more grim and violent, which went along with the kind of militarism that you saw in the Akkadian Empire. Sargon created the first naval expedition to places like Dilmun, present-day Bahrain. He also created a network of roads to connect the empire. You can see how this improved trade as well, with even a postal service along the roads. There was a real estate or property register. Keep track of who owned what land. Some of the early law codes came from Akkadia. And these law codes would influence Hammurabi's laws during the Babylonian Empire. Sargon probably created the first calendar by naming years after significant events of that year, significant events produced by the king in power at the time. So, like I said before, the Akkadians adopted a lot of the art, architecture, cuneiform from the earlier Sumerians, but definitely developed their own things and law, calendar, keeping track of time. They increased militarism. They were excellent administrators and merchants. The empire would fall only after just a century and a half, around 2154, because of the Gutian nomads who came down from the Zagros Mountains. The empire had already been weakened because of major climatic changes, which created drought. And this also, 2154, kind of coincides with the fall of the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt. So some type of volcanic eruption had caused massive climatic changes, which killed crops and led to drought. So the Akkadian area would experience a kind of dark age until the rise of the Babylonians to the south and the Syrians to the north, around 1800 BCE. So the Akkadian Empire, even though it didn't last that long, definitely would influence and create a classical standard for these later great empires. In the next episode, we will go into greater depth about Akkadian art and technique and technology. So I will see you then. Thank you for listening.